hello and welcome to anybody who's listening, either live or in the recorded video and watching it later. I'm Corinne Cunningham. I wrote a novel called Farm Girl, and I want to say thank you to Raquel and Writers Atelier and Megan for setting this up. I met Raquel through Instagram, I think. I can't even tell you when. Farm Girl is my novel. It's my first published book. I will say that I have always wanted to be a writer ever since I was a kid. I enjoy telling stories, writing stories more than telling stories, I will have to say. And, I wrote a lot up until I got to college. Then I studied political science and English and kind of lost the desire to write. And so I didn't do much writing until my children were born. They're now 13 and 11. And when they were really young, I started blogging. And I blogged mostly for the benefit of sharing what we were doing every day with grandparents and family members who lived far away. But that led me to remembering how much I enjoyed writing. And so quickly, that blog turned from little snippets about what the kids were doing to my writing about just life in general, life as I saw it. I used it as a way to process. And over the years, that turned into realizing that maybe I could dive into fiction, which had always been the thing that I thought I really wanted to do, but I'll do that someday. And so finally, I just kind of, one thing led to another and jumped in. And Farm Girl is not the only book I've written, but it's the only one that I've taken to the end point of having a book and publishing it. I self-published it back in October, so it's a couple months old, more than a couple. Time means nothing right now. I think we can all agree. So let's get started. All right, Farm Girl by Corinne Cunningham. Chapter 1. Bea Hampton jumped down from the bed of a two-tone cream and clay 1970s Chevy truck. The ground felt unforgiving beneath her steel-toed boots, but the first frost was yet to come. The softness of summer was fading. Green grass turned to brown more and more each day. Morning dew clung to her boots and dampened the hem of her frayed jeans. She stared out at the rows of apple trees lined up like rows of soldiers. A bit sloppy in the ranks, branches hanging low with abundance of fruit. Standing with her hands on her hips, she tried to calculate how many rows the crew would be able to get through by the end of the day. Deep in concentration, she didn't notice the figure approaching from the driver's side of the truck. Cliff Finley, owner of Finley Orchards, stepped next to her and put an arm around her back. His height swallowed her average 5'6" frame, and as she leaned into him, she took in the scent of pipe tobacco and coffee. Her nerves began to fade. "What of you, Farm Girl?" said Cliff. Bea smiled at the term of endearment, the playfulness in his voice. "It's something. There's a lot of work ahead of us." Still trying to calculate hours and manpower, she sighed. The best she could do was guess. She never remembered Cliff's formula and didn't have his years of experience. "I don't know how you do it every year. Organize everyone and keep them motivated. How you move the orchard through the seasons." Her shoulders shook as Cliff chuckled. "No one moves an orchard through the seasons. We follow its lead, and I do it because I love it, as does every single person who works here. You know that. It's too much work unless you care about this place. You've seen me here working the fields year in, year out since you were a little one. It shouldn't surprise you." His arm fell to his side, and he walked back to the truck. The hinge of the tailgate creaked when he lowered it. Then he started moving picking baskets onto the ground. The dozen baskets looked like marching band drums with their straps and handles. White canvas and buckles against a smattering of colors, sun-stained reds and blues, yellows and greens. The others should be here shortly. Do you remember how to do this? She laughed. I may have been away for a few years, but I haven't forgotten. She picked up one of the baskets and put a strap over each arm, adjusting the length. When she clicked the buckle together, it made a loud snap and sent a shiver down her spine in a sweet, homecoming sort of way. It's like riding a bike, she said, grinning at Cliff. It might not be in my blood, but it's in my heart. Cliff's smile was full of pride. He looked down at a clipboard he had grabbed from the truck and said, We're focusing on Max this morning, maybe empires this afternoon. Head on down to the right. Bea followed his gaze and gave a quick nod. She turned and walked between two trees and disappeared into the rows. As a child, she ran through these rows with reckless abandon. In winter months, she stomped through piles of snow and rolled snowballs into snowmen to keep the trees company. During springtime, she sat beneath flowering trees and made fairy houses out of fallen branches. She sought the shade of the trees during the summer months, and then autumn brought obstacle courses of fallen apples and pickers. Cliff gave her the run of the place, even though she was only his neighbor's granddaughter, a family friend. Her grandmother, Sylvia Eaton, lived across the street from Finley Orchards, and Beatrix was sent to her house multiple times during the year, for whole vacations and seasons at a time. Bea didn't mind, though. She enjoyed the comfort and ease of her grandmother's home and the orchard with its whimsy and seasonal changes far more than her parents' stuffy house near the city. Now the orchard was just as inviting as ever. The light only hinted at warmth, and she rubbed her hands together, wishing she brought gloves, and added them to a mental list of things to buy on her first trip into town. She chose a tree and got to work. It was about time she made her way into the small town of Cumberland to say hello to familiar faces, and maybe a few new ones. Over dinner the previous night, Cliff mentioned the additions to the local shop lineup. An artisan cheese shop, a craft beer cellar, and a coffee and ice cream shop. The old-fashioned hardware store, run by husband and wife team Olivia and Steve, still sat on the corner across from the gazebo, where the Christmas tree stood tall every December. Maybe they'll have work gloves that would do the trick, she thought to herself, picturing something a little softer than the rough gloves she could probably find in Cliff's barn. She wanted something worn in and comfortable, something her grandmother would have. But she couldn't walk in and go through the coat closet like she used to. She couldn't even walk up and knock on the door. Bea's stomach dropped and her breath hitched. She shoved the feeling down and stepped into the branches, enveloped by the fist-sized Max ready for picking. She nestled the basket between the branches and the base of the tree, lifted her shin against the tree while the base of the basket rested on her thigh. She reached for a clump of apples and took one by the hand. All of them were the perfect shade of red, no bruises or blemishes. She lifted the apple gently and rolled it off the branch, and though she placed it carefully in the basket, it made a light thump against the canvas. Hold on just a second. What kind of tea are you drinking? I'm drinking Earl Grey. Jasmine green. Oh, I am not a fan of green tea. I'm glad you are, but I'm not. Oh, and also, as Raquel is typing, if you have any questions, just go ahead and comment, and I'll answer them all after I've read a bit more. Okay. 4 dozen apples later, her thighs ached with weight and immobility. Her standing knee locked into place, and she teetered for a moment. She removed her leg from the tree and stood tall, shifting her weight back and forth to release tension. Birds sang, and the crisp morning air turned into a balm that caressed her cheek as it whispered through the branches. Bee closed her eyes and felt a sense of peace wash over her. The clenched jaw she hadn't noticed loosened, tense shoulders pulled down from her ears. Space was made between chest and chin as her head leaned back. A smile played on her lips for no one but herself. The rumbling of her stomach cut through the peacefulness, and she looked down at the watch on her wrist, not even close to lunchtime. As she had done 1,000 times throughout her life, she grabbed an apple off the tree and bit into it. The crisp, tart flesh of the apple left her cheeks puckering as she crunched through skin and flesh. Using the back of her hand, she wiped juice from her chin. "Are you going to pay for that?" Bee would have jumped at the sound of a voice, but the weight of the apples held her down. Her jaw clenched, shoulders pulled up, and the open spaces closed in a second. The songbirds vacated the tree and left a whir of wings against the air behind them. She turned around to see a man walking toward her. He stopped a few feet away from Bee. He was tall and had a slim but strong build, short wavy auburn hair, and his skin held the leftovers of a summer tan. He wore a red checkered flannel shirt, khaki pants, and his shoes. His shoes were all wrong for the orchard, even on a dry day. Loafers or brogues. They didn't belong in the sleepy orchard Bee grew up in, where everyone wore Wellingtons or work boots, depending on the weather. "Excuse me?" "I asked if you were going to pay for that." He motioned toward the apple in her hand. His voice was stern, but there was a hint of sparkle in his eyes, a playfulness waiting to be unleashed. He pointed toward the basket. "Eating crops and picking don't really go together," he said as he lifted his hand to shield his eyes from the sun. "Do I know you?" She placed one hand on her hip and the other held tightly to the offending apple. The basket hung low and swayed as she moved her weight to one side. "I don't think so. I'm a friend of Cliff's. Have you seen him?" He waited only a beat before responding. "No, I guess you haven't. If you're busy staring up at the sky and having lunch while the other pickers are working, keep picking. I'll find him myself." He huffed off and took with him the peacefulness Bee had found moments earlier. "Wait just a minute. Who do you think you are?" she shouted, and moved to the center of the aisle. Her heart raced as she watched him walk swiftly away. He looked back once and waved an arm as if to push aside her words. Her irritation grew as she stood staring ahead, watching his flannel back grow smaller and smaller. She took one last bite of the apple and flung it as far as she could. It rolled between trees, lost in the orchard to decompose. She tried to shake off the condescension and arrogance left in his wake, but could only turn back to the tree to top off her basket. After Bee filled it to the brim, she walked up the aisle of trees in search of a place to dump the apples and begin again. The sting from the earlier confrontation left her with a feeling of embarrassment with a side of dread. She had never had that feeling at the orchard. Bee had always felt like she belonged here, but today she felt like the new girl. When she was younger, working the orchard was easy, but it had been a good 10 years before she started college since she'd harvested apples alongside Cliff and his hodgepodge team of townies. The rest of the year Cliff was on his own, save for the days sprinkled here and there when a friend came to help with odds and ends, the jobs that took more than one person. Never once had Cliff hired someone to help off-season. He got by with the help of neighbors and friends who in turn benefited by ways of bushels of apples, gallons of cider, and the community garden on the edge of Finley Orchards. Cliff bartered for bigger jobs and even picking hours, trades of skill and time and energy, and the occasional pie or a few jars of applesauce. Voices brought her back to the present, to sunshine streaming across her shoulders, to the dampness growing outward from her armpits, and to the heavy basket in front of her that needed to be emptied. She looked around for where the voices were coming from, poked through the space between trees to the left, and saw nothing. She went through 2 aisles to the right and saw Cliff's unmistakable height and the breadth of his shoulders. With the basket between her legs, knees knocking the apples with each step, she waddled over to where Cliff was standing with a few other people. She sidled up, unnoticed, to the big bin where the apples were being collected. Carefully, she unlatched the hooks on her basket and reached over the edge of the receptacle to unleash a flow of fruit. Bee stood straight and readjusted her straps, latched the bottom back to the basket. She pulled her shoulders down and back, arching into a slight back bend. Bee, yelled Cliff, come on over. I want to introduce you to someone. Bee sighed. Small talk exhausted her. Cliff knew everyone in town, and since she returned, it felt like there had been a constant string of introductions or reintroductions. She made her way over to the circle of people, a handful of whom she recognized. People from local businesses who made time in their day for a few hours at the orchard here and there. A few jack-of-all tradesmen and women, newly retired townspeople for whom this was their first or second year picking as a way to pass the days. But as she approached the group, she saw one newly familiar figure. The man in the flannel shirt and inappropriate shoes was standing right next to Cliff. Bee avoided looking at him as she moved to the other side of Cliff. She nodded to the people she recognized, spoke quiet hellos and how are yous. Though she felt the man's gaze on her, she didn't bring herself to look at him until Cliff put a hand on her arm to get her attention. Bee, this is my neighbor, Graham Winters, he said, and gestured towards the man who had waved her off in the orchard. Graham deals in the antique book business and helps around here in his spare time. He's keeping us all in line, Cliff chuckled softly. The sides of his eyes crinkled as he looked at Graham endearingly. Graham, this is Beatrix Hampton, longtime friend of the orchard and surrogate daughter of mine, my farm girl. He put an arm around Bee and squeezed. Graham extended his hand to her, and Bee reached across Cliff for a handshake. Nice to meet you officially, Graham. Her words were clipped. She went through the street mentally, trying to figure out which house this neighbor could belong to. The pleasure is all mine. His words were equally clipped, and she couldn't tell if his smile was as forced as her own. To her, it looked like he didn't spend much time smiling. Between his eyebrows were deep frown lines. Officially, have you met before? Cliff asked. Yes, Graham started. I was beginning to tell you about a wayward picker when I first joined you all. Cliff laughed. Ah, yes, it's Bee's first day back at picking. She's allowed some leeway. Give her another day or two, and she'll be back in full force. When she gets going, she's more dedicated than I am, and it'd break my back if I picked as much as she's been known to in a day. Ever since the day we met, she's been as in love with this place as I am. Do you remember that day, Bee? Bee nodded. She was 3 years old the first time she met him. She had held her grandmother's hand tightly as she looked nearly to the clouds to find his face. He was as tall and as wide as a lumberjack. Cliff knelt down to her level, and his twinkly blue eyes looked right into Bee's. He extended his hand, and she let go of her grandmother and watched her as her hand disappeared into his. Her jaw dropped in awe. She looked up and saw his soft smile, and it eased any fear she had of the giant man before her. Now she smiled at Cliff with the memory. I also remember us talking about how my name was spelled like Beatrix Potter. I couldn't believe you knew about Peter Rabbit. And I couldn't believe you weren't allowed to play in your parents' garden. Such a travesty. He shook his head and looked at Graham. So I gave her the run of the place, the apple farm, as she called it back then. That's why I started calling her farm girl. Cliff looked fondly at Bee. Glad to hear I misjudged, said Graham. His eyes focused on Beatrix, but she escaped them, focusing her gaze elsewhere. On Cliff, on the orchard, on the people who had left their circle right after the introduction was made. A few people were halfway down the rows of mackintosh trees in search of more apples to fill newly emptied baskets. Bees, said Cliff, hesitating for a moment. Graham recently bought your grandmother's house. Her eyes opened wide and an electric jolt coursed through her body. I didn't realize it was for sale again. She turned to Cliff. Why didn't you tell me? Cliff crossed his arms in front of him and widened his stance. He looked down to the ground and then past Bee through the rows of trees. It didn't happen often, but Cliff Finley was at a loss for words. Graham spoke before Cliff. It was a quick sale. I had an offer in before it was on the market a whole 48 hours. And do you like it? Asked Bee. She attempted to cross her own arms, but the basket in front of her was in the way. She rested her hands on her hips instead. I do, very much. It's a lovely house. Lots of character. Very New England. Do you have a family? She couldn't help herself. She knew nothing about this man except that he was living in her beloved grandmother's home, and that was enough, aside from their earlier interaction, for her to dislike him. I don't. It's just me. Quite a big house for just one person. Graham shrugged his shoulders and stuffed his hands in his pants pockets. Bee looked closely at him, at the pockmarks on his cheeks, the softness in his gray eyes that flicked with regret. Cliff laughed softly. The farmhouse is a big place for just me, but somehow I've managed to fill it to the brim over the years. Bee took a deep breath and said, well, I'd better head back out. It'll be lunchtime before we know it. She kissed Cliff's cheek and gave a slight but pointed nod to Graham before she walked back down and across 2 aisles of trees to her picking spot. Even though she didn't dare look back, she felt 2 sets of eyes on her as she walked, and they were at odds. The familiar, concerned eyes of Cliff and the new, unknown eyes of the man who lived in her childhood home. All right, I think there's only a little bit left, but I think my voice is good for reading. So that was the beginning of Farm Girl. I'm going to poke through here to see if you guys have questions. It's rainy in Florida. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. That is a bummer. Jenny, thank you. I love listening to authors read their books as well. I'm not as big of a fan as reading my own book out loud, but thank you guys for bearing with me on that. Beautiful story. What inspired you to write? Jenny, Scottish breakfast tea. Yes, that is good to me. All right, I'm going to, those are all wonderful questions. I asked for questions on Instagram. I have 2, so I thought I'd answer those first before answering questions that you guys have, because I've thought about these a little bit. The first one was, how long was this story swirling around in your head before writing it? The short answer is a long time, a couple years. When I started branching off from blogging into writing more fiction, I went to a workshop at a place in Boston that's very similar to Writer's Atelier. It's called Grub Street, and they have a ton of resources for writers, just anything you could possibly need. And so I went to a workshop on free writing, and somehow like the nugget of an idea came through then. And so that was probably Paige is now 11 and she was maybe 3. So that was 7-8 years ago. Yeah, so it swirled around and went through several iterations. I actually wrote an entire other novel for National Novel Writing Month that took place at an orchard and had a Beatrix, but it was a very different story, and it was one that I needed to write for myself personally. I had some things that I needed to work through, and so that story will probably never see the light of day. Maybe some elements, because if you've read Farm Girl, there's a family who's kind of new to town and is mentioned briefly, that makes their own cider using apples from Cliff's orchard. And so it was kind of the story of that family. There were two kids, a husband and wife. They homeschooled their small children, which we homeschool our kids, even when it's not quarantine schooling. And so that was the beginning. And then it didn't feel like the end. So I let it simmer for a little while longer, and then went back and worked through the idea that is now Farm Girl. The second question I had was, what surprised you most about this journey? And I think the thing that surprised me most was, or is, how people have been able to connect with the characters in this book, and overlook the flaws in the book. As it's a self-published book, it's not perfect, and I'm more than aware of that. And there's a question about self-publishing that I can see, that I'll get into that a little bit more. But yeah, I've been really surprised how people have been able to connect with Bee and Cliff and Graham and a couple of the minor characters as well. I spent a lot of time with these characters, and they were very near and dear to me. But I always kind of wondered, I have in my head all of the things that didn't even make it into the book about them. And so I wasn't sure if they were as well formed as I thought they were, because anyone who writes knows that you have so much more in your head that doesn't actually make it to the paper, and sometimes you forget what you shared about characters and what you haven't. So that's been a lovely surprise throughout the process. All right, let's see what questions you all have. All right. What inspired you to write this beautiful writing? Thank you. What inspired you to write this story? So at that workshop that I mentioned, I kept coming back to this picture of an orchard. And, at the time, my children were very young, and we spent a lot of time going different places. And there was a local orchard that this is roughly based off of, that had animals, and we always went to visit the animals and walk around the grounds and whatnot. And that image was what kind of got me started on the story. And then I had this idea of a young woman interacting with an older man at the orchard in some work capacity and trying to figure out their relationship. And that was the original idea. And when I wrote the different iteration of the story, there was no older man involved. Like I said, it changed into something that I needed it to be. And so really the core of this story has to do with the relationship with Bee and Cliff, and yeah, so that was kind of it. Being around the orchard, I drive by every once in a while. Even if we're not going to the orchard, I kind of go out of my way to go visit it, because the location just really brings back a flood of emotions, both as a mother with, visiting with the kids, but also in this story, because that really was the main inspiration. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Excellent choice. Thank you. How long did it take you to write this book? It took, I think it was about 2.5 years, with a good 6-month break in the middle of it. I started writing it in earnest, and 6 months into that, we had some big family drama, and I couldn't focus on it. My thought was elsewhere. My mind was elsewhere, and so I took a break. And at one point, I wasn't sure I was going to come back to it because I just didn't know. And I think even, yeah, so I had started in a January. I can't remember what year. Started in a January. By June, I had stopped. Following that November, I worked on a completely different novel for National Novel Writing Month. And then by December, I started thinking, you know what, I'd really like to revisit this. I would really like to finish Farm Girl and see what can happen, because I think there's something to it. It just kept drawing me back in. So from that point, I worked with a friend of mine as an accountability partner, and finished the first draft in another 6 months, and then went through several rounds of editing over the next year, which, I'm a homeschooling mom. I'm at home with the kids. For me, that schedule worked. It might not seem very fast. It might seem fast. I really don't know, but it's what worked for me. And at this point, I'm starting another novel, and I can see that time period working again, which is a little discouraging because right now it feels like a very long time. Let's see. Why did you decide to self-publish, and how did I do it? I decided to self-publish. At first, I wasn't going to. At first, I wanted to go about their traditional route of publishing, and I put together my query letter. I did the synopsis. I did all of the things, and I sent out a lot of queries to agents. And for a good couple months, just really focused on that. I focused on sending out letters every couple days, getting rejections, which I knew was part of the process. And I thought, this is what you have to do. But as time went on, and I want to say this very carefully, I truly believe in traditional publishing. I think it works. I think it's great. There are benefits to it. Someday, the next book might go that way. But what started happening was I would get an email out of the blue with a rejection, and that really would mess up my day. I would get really bummed out about it, and that would mess up how I was showing up for my kids. And so all of that started playing with my mental health, and I got to a point where I thought I either need to learn how to handle this or figure out what my motivation is for getting this book out into the world. And for this specific book, all I really wanted to do was to share the story with people who had been supporting me emotionally in writing ways over the years, because I'd been very public about the writing process on through my blog and through my Instagram account. I just wanted to share the story. And so when I realized that, I thought, well, self-publishing might be the way to go for this book. And once I made that decision, I felt a huge weight come off my shoulders, and I knew that this was the right thing to do it. I chose the easiest way possible, which I'm not sure I would recommend. I chose to do it all through Amazon, which was super easy and super cost effective. The downside of that is, I'm not going to find my book in indie bookstores, and so moving forward, I might try to use, I think it's Ingram Sparks or a different way. But I did it all through Amazon. I used a lot of YouTube tutorials um, as you know, how to do it. I I used a couple people for critiques and for editing. It did go through several rounds of editing um, with other people's eyes. But again, and one of the things that I do think a traditionally published book benefits from is having several eyes on it. I think that's a huge benefit. I did not have the budget to do that, and so it is what it is, and I'm really happy with it, honestly. If that didn't answer your question, you want more specifics, just let me know. Let's see. I was inspired by Grub Street. Grub Street is a really amazing, it's an amazing place. And we live about an hour north of Boston now. At the time, we lived closer and it was easier to get down there to the city. But now it's a bit of a, it's a bit of a trek. And I would love to see something like that more up my way, and I'm not sure if there is just on the other side of the border in Portsmouth. But that's definitely something that I want to look into after this is all over, after we can gather as together again, because it's so important to have other writers and around you and to have that support, and online interaction is wonderful. I wouldn't have gotten as far as I have now without that. But there is something about being in person that's just, it's magic. So I think that's awesome that you were inspired by them to start. What is your writing routine like? Every day or scheduled certain days, mornings, night, afternoons? Right now, it's pretty non-existent. It's kind of, I take it when I can. When I am full on involved in a project, I need to be in it Monday through Friday at some point. I have to touch the work. Otherwise, it's really easy for me to get out of a groove. And so the writing routine is really either between 5 and 7 in the morning before our day gets started, or if we're home, between 1 and 3. So I try really hard to get at least an hour, most of the time an hour and a half to 2 hours daily. I wish I could write at night. I just can't. I have tried, and I really like spending time with my husband at the end of the day. So, and again, being at home with the kids, it's a challenge to find the time, but it's always worth it, even if it means getting up extra early. Do you have any particular writing routines or rituals? Again, it depends. On a good day, when I remember to, I enjoy lighting a candle before I work. I try to turn off my internet. I put on music. If that's a tricky thing though, because only during certain parts of the writing process can I listen to music. Mostly it's editing. Yeah, mostly it's editing. I don't really listen to music while I'm drafting because it just distracts me. Yeah, but really it's that sitting down, lighting a candle, turning off the internet. It's huge. That's really what needs to happen for me to get into the groove. And unfortunately, I also can't really work when there's anybody else around. I've tried to for different things. All right, no, the caffeine hasn't hit me yet. For it's actually kind of funny. For writing nonfiction, I can write with people around and noise around. But for writing fiction, I can't. I feel like it uses a completely different part of my brain. Yeah, because I know I've written a couple essays and guest posts for blogs and things in the middle of the day with things going on around me, and that works fine. I could relate to Beatrix's protective feelings about her childhood home. Did you ever have a similar relationship with a place in your life? That's a really great question, Becca. What I've come back to again and again as I think about this story is I've always been fascinated with the concept of home, and finding home in different places because, and I think it's because as a kid, we moved frequently. It wasn't really because of a job. My dad worked at the same place until I got married. But we just moved around to different houses around the same area, kind of, in the seacoast of New Hampshire, actually. And so I remember, I do remember getting attached to certain places, and looking back, I have two houses in mind that I have like super fond memories of. I'm still like, why couldn't we have just stayed there? That was a great place. So those two places, maybe I do think of like that. I'm gonna have to give that some more thought though. That's interesting. But yeah, I'm fascinated by the idea of home and the relationship, like you said in that question, the relationship that we have with different places. Yeah, actually, what's really interesting is I think my grandparents' house. I just realized this now, Becca. My grandparents had the same house. They lived in the same place for a very, very long time. And when they moved out of that house, that was hard for me. And we didn't even visit them very often. But that was a really stable, not stable, just, it was just it was the one place. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. I had not put that together. And that, again, I'm going to have to think about that more. Pros and cons to every publishing path. That is so true. It really is. Each book is different as well. It really is. And I think that each book serves a different purpose. Like I said, I've written several, and they've all done something for my writing process, for my personal growth as well. Every book is different. They all serve a different purpose, and not all of them need to be shared. And that's kind of an odd thing to say, but some books you can write just for yourself. And if they get shared, that's awesome. But if not, the work is still valid and your writing is still valid. And I think that that's something that that we need to talk about more too. Ingram is awesome. That's good to know. That is really good to know. I think it kind of scared me a little bit to look at different things when I was trying to figure out the self-publishing journey. That was a great explanation. Thank you, Jenny. Do you all have any other questions for me? And I didn't see any comments about wanting a book to be given away. So I'm happy not to if nobody wants one. I think most of you who are here right now have read the book. Yeah, so I'm just trying to think on the fly. This is why I write, because I'm a much better writer than speaker. All right. Yeah, I'm trying to think of any other little tidbits. Do you guys have any questions? If you've read the book and you have any questions that might include spoilers, we're 50 minutes into this, and if anybody makes it this far, we can say, there's a spoiler coming. But yeah, if you have questions about characters in the book in particular or not. Oh, there's more. Not everything you write has to be shared. Yeah. Thank you. You have it in print and ebook. That's amazing. Thank you. Yeah, it's really funny how we think about writing and work and the validity of things, and what we give ourselves permission to work on and make time for, and what we actually call work. And yeah, I think writing deserves more credit. A lot of people give it the non-published stuff. What do you enjoy doing outside of writing? I enjoy knitting. I enjoy reading. I really enjoy spending time at the beach. So I'm really missing that right now. Even just going for a walk. They've closed all of the places that we tend to go. So yeah, I kind of miss doing that. I wish I could say that there was something completely like out of the norm that I enjoy doing, but not really. Yeah, right now it's knitting. What's really funny is we're watching The Office with the kids, and I had completely forgot how much I really enjoyed watching a good, well-written sitcom. And that one is it's hysterical. I really like to laugh right now. I really like to laugh. I used to knit, but I think I've forgotten how. It's like riding a bike. I actually learned when I was very, very young. I don't know, 8 or 9 maybe, and didn't knit for a long, long time. And then Paige was maybe 2 or 3. So again, the same time that I was writing or beginning to write, I picked knitting back up and kind of had to reteach myself. And yeah, I really enjoyed that process of relearning and seeing something grow in my hands. And I think especially for writers, like we work on these projects that are they feel never ending. I just saw something about how, I forget what the quote was, and I shared it on Instagram, where writing is not only a marathon, it's like 10 marathons in one because it just keeps going. And so to have a project that you can finish at some point is just incredible, and you don't have to really go back through and edit it. It just grows, and it's wonderful. We love The Office. It's just so funny, and it holds up so well. I could not believe it. There's so many topics, even in the first season, that it started, and I was like, oh, I wonder how this is going to feel to watch now. And it was just as good, if not more relevant than it was 15 years ago. And watching the kids and process that, and the conversations that can start from all of that, it's fantastic. It's wonderful. Jenny, you said, and your mom would love a physical copy. All right. No one else has said anything, so I am happy to send your mom, a copy. I'm going to have to reorder a bunch of writer copies, and then I can sign it for you. So it might not be right away, like I said earlier. But yeah, I will get that to you. I'll be in touch because we're connected here and on Instagram. So I will get that out to you. So it's been about an hour. So I think I'll wrap this up, if that's okay. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for being here for my nervous energy. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate the opportunity to do this and to connect in a different way. Again, I think it's important. I think it's it's a great way to, just to connect and to share some words and some stories. So thank you, Writers Atelier. Thank you for everyone who joined, and thank you to those of you who might watch on a recording, who watch after the fact. Yeah. So again, thank you very much, and you can find all of my information in the information section of this event. Be well, be safe, take care, wash your hands, and take care of yourself in whatever way you need to. Sending you all lots of love and strength as we all get through this very bizarre time. So thank you again. All right. Bye, guys.